But next up, we're going to listen to Bill Mitchell, again, one of the other founders of MMT. I remember I first came across Bill's blog, which in one sense is utterly terrifying, because when anyone's criticising MMT online, Bill goes to town on them completely. He will literally go spec by spec on debunking and put forward academic and real evidence forward. So, and he's going to do the same thing just now by showing you the data for Scotland, and it's going to be really fascinating. So, ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome to Professor Bill Mitchell.
You know, I've spent my whole working life in the academy, and I started this journey in a sort of weird way, because when I was studying agricultural economics, Australia had a wool price stabilisation scheme because the rural lobby was very powerful, and they wanted their incomes to be stabilised and to avoid the fluctuations from the variations in the wool clip. So, you know, so they wanted to smooth out their income over a period. And so the federal government agreed that they would guarantee their price each year. And the way they did that was that they built these huge red brick buildings in all of our cities, big warehouses, and they're called wool stores. And that each market period, if they would come into the market, either as a buyer or a seller, depending upon the clip that was brought by the wool farmers to the market. And so when the clip was up, which would have meant an excess supply of wool in relative to demand for wool by the wool buyers, the government would buy the excess wool, store it in the wool stores, and the price would be stable. So the government would take the excess supply out of the market. And when the clip was down on any year for whatever reason, drought or disease or whatever, bushfire, these are all things that we deal with, and the market conditions meant then that there would be an excess demand for the wool, which would have driven the price up above the agreed price. The government then got the trucks out of the wool store, delivered the wool into the market to bring the price back to the agreed level. Now, you know, I think back to, this was 1978, I was in my fourth year at Melbourne University, and I wasn't really much interested in wool. But what was going on at the same time was the government's response to the aftermath of the OPEC oil price crisis. And the response we had, as every advanced country had, was an inflation surge, because, you know, oil doubled overnight almost, and the government response was austerity. And so at that period, we'd gone from a long post-war period of 2% or less unemployment to 7 or 8% unemployment. And that was what I was really concerned about. So I'm sitting there studying the wool price stabilisation scheme, and I realised that this was a full employment scheme for wool. And the same principles of buffer stocks, the buffer being sometimes the government would increase it, load up their wool store, sometimes they would release the wool back into the market, and the buffer would go up and down depending upon the demand conditions in the private market. That was a full employment of wool scheme. And the same principle then led me to write as a student about the full employment of people using a buffer stock of jobs. So that's sort of where I started, and it was nothing to do with modern monetary theory at the time, but it was a inflation stabilisation scheme. And it was quite a bit later, we in the very early days of the internet, we had an email discussion list among heterodox economists, and I was by then an academic, not a student. And Warren was sort of emerged on that list, and then, you know, there was interesting discussions, and then one Saturday, I think it was, Warren will correct me if I'm wrong, I was just at home mucking around, and this brash American rings me up. Now, to put it in perspective, Australians think all Americans are brash. But this brash American rings me up and says, look, I've been liking what you're saying on this discussion. Can we get together? And so Warren brought his family up and met my family up where we were living up up the coast from Sydney. And
where were you?
Araring, by the lake, yeah. And on the 10 acres, yeah. And we're a little permaculture joint. And we got talking, and that's, to me, where we put our ideas together. Warren had a background in banking and financial markets, and the buffer stocks things all meshed in there. Warren had already worked that out too, and that's how MMT started. So 1994, I think that was, if I'm about then. I mean, your memory gets pretty vague when you're at this time of day. And so that's when we started this project, and then Warren worked to bring some other academics, Randy Ray, a couple of graduate students, Pavlina and Matt, and then Fidel, and later Stephanie and Scott, and so it grew from there. And Warren and I used to laugh that we could count the MMTers on one hand and we'd still have some fingers spare. And then we used to have our annual get-togethers in the 90s, and we'd celebrate when we sort of went off the one hand onto two. And now you look out there and it's gone wild. So it's an interesting phenomenon, the way in which a new paradigm, completely new paradigm, builds, and I'm glad I'm there from the foundation. It builds and grows, and people ignore you. The mainstream completely avoids any interaction at all, and then eventually it gets to the stage where a threat is perceived to the orthodoxy, and then they start attacking you, and then there's all sorts of dissonance created in the mainstream, and that's what we're seeing now.
How about the US Senate?
Oh yeah, I'll come back to that in a second. You just lost my thought. And so we're seeing this growing of a new paradigm, and we've got to the stage where last week the 5 Republican senators in the American Congress have put a bill to the Congress to condemn us, to condemn modern monetary theory as a danger to America. And if you go to my blog, you can download the bill and feel fantastic. And that's telling me now that the dissonance has become so great that the paranoia is now setting in. Careers are now being threatened. And so that's a little brief history. We've got to go the other way, don't we? I'm at a loss here because I can't see. Okay. So what I wanted to do, and what the organisers asked me to do, was to reflect on some of the practical matters. Warren's given a fairly good conceptual outline. I'll deal with some concepts and some practical matters. And I'm sort of a pedant in the sense that you've got to get things right, otherwise things run out of control. You've got to get a new idea correctly specified, otherwise it becomes misused. And one of the things we're seeing, and this Congress bill, the draft of the bill, is MMT's dangerous, and people both on the conservative side and the progressive side who think they've got a handle on what modern monetary theory is about lapse into this thing, oh, when we have MMT, when we shift to MMT, and I note there's a bias in this podium to the left, which I think is good. When we have MMT, or when we shift to MMT, it's going to be havoc or it's going to be great, depending on where you sit. And get it into your head from day one that MMT is out there now. What MMT is, what our body of work is what I've called a lens for providing a superior understanding of the way the monetary system works and the capacities of the currency issuer within that monetary system. So out there is a monetary system. It's pretty much the same every country. The operations of the government and the central banks are all pretty much the same. They call them different things, the accounts and what have you, but it's pretty much the same, right across cultural different variations and diversity. And what MMT is a better way of understanding that, of looking into the system and understanding it. It's not something we're going to shift to. It's just a way, a frame in which you are provided with a better way of understanding what's going on. And I have this expression that why it's valuable is that it exposes a lot of the myths that pervade in our political narratives. It exposes what I call the veil of ideology. And so if everybody had an understanding of MMTs as I have, then a politician wouldn't be able to get up there and say, we can't do anything about 10% unemployment because we haven't got enough money. Or we can't address climate change because we haven't got enough money, we're going to run out of money. Or we can't do this because the bond markets won't lend us the money, they'll shut us down. And politicians do that every day, and we let them do it because we're ignorant. And if everybody has an MMT understanding, then the ideology that's embedded in that statement, we're running out of money, becomes exposed. And the politician then has to have a different reason for having 10% unemployment. In other words, they've got to justify why they think that's useful, because we would all know that the government could do something about that. It's nothing to do with having not enough money. And I think that's a really powerful enhancement of our democracies to understand MMT. Now, the lens versus values bit is that really MMT is agnostic about policy. And this is a really important point to make. It just happens that the developers of MMT are relatively progressive people. But you can't say that MMT is a left project. MMT, as it stands as a body of academic knowledge, is agnostic about particular policy choices. And to make it operational in a political sense, a policy sense, you have to impose a value system on top of it. And so a right-winger who understood MMT would have a set of policies according to their values of individualism and corporate fraud and all the rest of it. Whereas a left-winger like me has another set of values, that I want good public transport, I don't want privatisation, I want public health systems, I don't want privatisation, I want good public infrastructure, I want nationalisation of transport and energy and water, and I want nationalisation of banking and all of those things. But MMT doesn't tell you that. MMT tells you what the consequences of doing things are, not what you should do. And so you can't walk around thinking that you're an MMTer, therefore you're left or you're right. That's a very important point. It's getting closer to breakfast time, I'm feeling better. Now, some other things to get straight, and these are all just building on the Warren slideshow, expressing it in a different way. We have different ways of speaking, just as we have different accents. I remember once, when I was younger, I gave a talk in Chicago, and this character gets up in the audience. He was very brash, Warren. And he goes, "Excuse me, I can't understand your word you're saying." And I said, "What? What did you say?" So there you go. A fundamental principle of MMT is that a currency issuing government can buy whatever is for sale in that currency, including all idle labour. That's a fundamental thing to understand and rote learn and repeat at every dinner party and golf game and wherever you talk to people about things. A currency issuing government can always buy whatever is for sale in that currency, including all idle labour. Now, that sounds pretty trivial, but it becomes a very powerful cognitive thing, because then you start to think, well, gosh, what does that mean? And what it means for a start is that no politician can then tell you that unemployment is a complex issue. What you now know, once you accept this first statement, is that the government chooses the unemployment rate. It's not created in an amorphous market. It's not out of control. It doesn't come from things that are not understandable. The government chooses the unemployment rate. And once you understand that, then you know who to hold accountable for mass unemployment. Because with one policy, they could solve that unemployment. The Prime Minister of Australia could get up tomorrow. They can't at the moment, we're in election, so they're in caretaker mode, but they could get up tomorrow and say, everybody who wants a job, turn up to the Centrelink office. The Centrelink office dishes out the income support for unemployment benefits. They could say, turn up and get a job. Unemployment, the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics, would do their next survey. Unemployment would be about 1% instead of whatever it is. And what that means is you then understand that there is no financial constraint on government spending. And so once you say that, well, what the hell have I been thinking all these years? The active mind says, well, what would be the constraint on government spending? And then you revert back to the first proposition, and that is that the availability of goods and services for sale in that currency. And it doesn't mean, and there's a lot of progressives very enthusiastic at the moment, and I love enthusiasm, about the Green New Deal, that we can have this Green New Deal tomorrow. Well, no, you can't. Saying that the government has no financial constraint doesn't mean there's no real consequences of it making particular spending decisions against others. It doesn't mean that a government can just buy everything immediately. There's real constraints and time constraints. Another fundamental, what having your currency doesn't mean, and this is a really important one for Scotland, I think. And it doesn't mean that your country is going to prosper in a material sense. Because what really limits the availability of real resources for sale are the underlying real resources that go into those goods and services. So if you're a poor country with limited access to real resources and limited ability to swap what real resources you might have through trade for other real resources, well then having your own currency is still going to leave you poor. What having your own currency means in that context is that what real resources you do have available will be fully utilised, fully produced, fully employed. But you still may be in an impoverished state. And those who are aware of my writings know that that, in my view, leads to a need for a multilateral agency that all nations participate in that allows poor countries to get real resources that they can't otherwise get. In other words, scrap the IMF and substitute it with something that really cares about people. And so I don't think Warren or I are here saying that Scotland's necessarily going to prosper by having your own currency. It all depends. My bet is that you'll eventually do well, but when you do become independent, don't turn around and say, well, that creature Bill Mitchell said we'd be immediately better off, because I'm not so sure you will be. There could be a little transition shock, but who knows? But don't say that MMT immediately says you're going to be richer by having your own currency in material terms. You'll be happier anyway. So here's a few ways of the way I'm thinking about Scotland at the moment. And this is after an exhaustive examination of very poor data. Economists like me deal with national statistical agencies all the time, and the Office of National Statistics is one of the worst. And so Scotland's done a really good job, I think, trying to build its own picture out of the official data. It's still pretty poor, but they've done a pretty good job. So you're trying to get a picture of what it would to allow scenarios to emerge of what it would look like if you're independent. So here's the first one. This is the external position. This is the net trade in goods and services, and the red line is noting that the majority of trade is with the rest of the UK. But the red line nets that out, which is sort of the way people, what's that group? The business group, lobby group. What?
Business Restore.
Yeah, they tried to claim in a publication that you were running trade surpluses. Now, the regional trade statistics they used indicate that, but they don't include services, they only include goods, and they only include trade with the rest of the world, not the internal trade within the UK. And the blue line's the really realistic picture, and what that about 6 to 7% of GDP around there. Now, what that means is that you're doing if that position persisted, then you should be feeling really good, because you're getting more coming in from outside, including rest of UK, than you're having to send them. So reflect on what Warren said about exports and imports, the benefits and costs. If you can persuade the rest of the world to ship more stuff to you than you ship to them, then you're on a winner. And so you should reflect on that. This export mania is irrational. Since when is it a good thing to give away your productive resources to someone else and get less back in return? It's not my idea of a good time. what that also means, importantly, is that in jargon, there's a net drain of spending going out of the country. So there's income being produced by the country, and if you're running external deficits, it means that some of that income's going out in greater quantities than it is coming in from income produced abroad, including the rest of UK. And so that net income drain, that leakage from your income system, would spell trouble if it wasn't offset with something else in a minute. My summary of the data. The trade with the rest of the UK, Scottish trade with the rest of the UK, is about 4 times your trade with the rest of the EU. The EU is a relatively insignificant trade partner when you compare it to the rest of the UK. Okay, another thing that an MMT economist will look at is the private domestic sector, which consists of households and firms. And this is the household saving ratio. The red line's the average over this. The data that the Scottish Government's been able to assemble goes back to 1998. And so the average household saving ratio out of its disposable income, their income less tax, is about 7.5%. And you can see that at the moment there's a squeeze on. It's less than that, but it's always positive. A country like Australia during the just before the crisis, we had negative household savings as the government was running surpluses. The household sector was going wild with bank lending and credit. That's less apparent in Scotland, but you can see just before and I'm pointing to that in the middle of the graph for people over there. This has probably got a point of it. You can see just before the crisis, there was a squeeze on households, and then the crisis adjusted, and that squeeze is getting back on. Now that's coming from the central government, that squeeze, because George Osborne's June 2010 fiscal statement, just after they were elected in May, started a fiscal period where they were squeezing government spending, net spending, and they were relying on households to go increasingly into debt to maintain spending growth in the economy as the government was taking it out. Now, at the time, Osborne, if you know better than me, was raving that there was going to be this, the march of the makers, I think David Cameron talked about, this huge export boom. Well, that didn't happen. And subsequent fiscal statements from your central government have been squeezes on private sector, households particularly, and business firms to push up their indebtedness. And this is UK. You can't actually get household debt as a percentage of disposable income for Scotland, but it's this UK. You can see that household debt's at a very high level. And just anecdotal reports in the press, you can read them, household debt rising, alarming, struggling to pay, 1 in 4 Scottish children and families facing impossible decisions with respect to their finances. So there's a chronic problem building up in Scottish households. Think about that. This is a business investment ratio, the other side of the private domestic sector. And what you're seeing is that in this austerity period, there's been a decline in Scottish business investment as a percentage of total income. Now, if you put those two elements of the private domestic sector together, what that tells me, as a conjecture, I wouldn't bet my house on it, but I'd probably stand my reputation on it, is that there is a long-term desire to net save overall in the Scottish private domestic sector. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that there's in terms of the private domestic sector, households and firms, They won't want to spend all the income that they receive. There's a leakage from the spending system through saving. Second point to put together. And here's the fiscal position. There's all debates about North Sea oil revenue and all of that. It's pretty irrelevant, really, to the story. The green line's the UK position, and you can see from 2009-10, you can see the fiscal squeeze going on. The green line's going back towards zero. And that's mainly, on Sunday I'm in London talking to local government officials. That's mainly been manifest through the disastrous squeeze on local councils. Massive reduction in their capacity to offer services to people. But you can see the Scottish, once we net out things with the rest of the UK, the blue line is Scotland excluding North Sea oil, but you can see that it doesn't really matter much. The red line's including North Sea revenue. That deficit's about 8% of GDP. Now that's a relatively large deficit in international terms, but it's probably too small. Why do I say it's too small? Because the private domestic sector is obviously got an inclination to save more out of its disposable income and take more money out than it is. It's being squeezed by that green line, that fiscal drag coming from the central government. The business investment ratio is historically low. So in other words, there's not enough activity going on to stimulate a incentive of business firms to invest more as a percentage of income. So my bet is that if there was stronger growth, the investment ratio will rise back to higher levels than there are now, which are reflecting just the austerity in the economy. And so the 8% Scottish deficit now is likely to have to go up a bit more. Now, the Growth Commission thinks that it's appropriate that deficit is less than 3%. Okay, so I say to myself as an MMT economist, how could that be possible without causing damage? Well, you could have an export boom, but you've got an external deficit of 7% or something. You'd have to have a massive structural shift in your economy, and it's not going to happen. So that drain of spending is going to be going out when you're independent. Households are wanting to save more, I reckon, given the crisis that's now because of that green austerity. So that drain's going to go up. Businesses are at suppressed levels of investment. They want to push that up. That'll offset to some extent the drain of increased household savings on spending. So there's an enormous spending gap that 8% deficit is currently trying to fill. And as Warren says, he thinks there's more, and I agree, that there's probably a lot of excess capacity in the Scottish economy. So you're looking at deficits of probably 10% at least. So when contemplating going to independence, don't let anybody tell you that you're going to be able to go there without extreme damage unless you're prepared to let your fiscal deficit rise a bit, probably to in excess of 10%. And anybody who tells you that a program to move the deficit to 3% or below is really saying they want you to have a massive recession and a permanent state of stagnation. So when people have got to get their heads around the realities of what independence would require from your government. I just want to, Tim's already done the ridiculousness of the 6 tests. which came out of... by the way, he alluded to the 3% rule. It's the Stability and Growth Pact rule in the Eurozone. And in a book, my second last book, I wrote, I did a forensic investigation on where that rule came from. And one night, Francois Mitterrand's office rang up the finance bureaucrats and said, listen, we've got a problem. We're coming up to election. This is before the Euro. And we've got a problem. We've got to look as though we're fiscally responsible, but we actually don't want to do any damage to the economy. So you've got to come up with a number that's more or less what we're doing now, but sounds like it's tough. So these bureaucrats, apparently into the late hours, did some analysis on what was going on and came up with 3%. And Mitterrand said, "That's great. That sounds credible. It's not going to do much. It's not much different to what we are, but we'll be able to sell it as fiscal responsibility." Now, the guy who... And later on, during the discussions in the late 90s, when the actual flesh was being put on the Maastricht Treaty, and Theodore Weigel, a German finance minister, proposed the Stability Pact, and the French said, no, it has to be a Stability and Growth Pact, nobody will cope. They were discussing what the parameters of the pact would be, and the French were able to convince the Germans that 3% sounded pretty tough. And the guy who actually did the back of the envelope calculation for Mitterrand in the the Euro has come out recently in the French press saying there was nothing economic about it at all. It was a purely ad hoc political fix for the problem that Mitterrand was in approaching a national election. So next time you see any of the Growth Commission characters, tell them that story. Where did they get the 3% from? It sounds to me like what we call cultural cringe, that you somehow think that the European Commission's got a technical boffins. Well, they're idiots. Okay, so Tim's already done the 6 tests, but there are some very important MMT principles underlying the 6 tests that allow you to expand your MMT understanding. I've got about 5 minutes to go. The first one is this concept of what we mean by fiscal sustainability. So a mainstream economist gets up very serious to an audience and says, we've got to be IMF official or someone like that. We've got to be fiscally sustainable. And then they put up charts with debt ratios and thresholds and rules and deficit limits. And as soon as they do that, you know they haven't got a clue. Because the only way you can understand fiscal sustainability is in terms of a context. Now, those graphs I put up before are context. Because if you've got the non-government sector leaking spending, then there's only one other sector that can fill the gap, unless you're happy to have recession and high unemployment. And so when we think about, and go back to Warren's, and other than the Pompey case study, go back to his first graph of what do you want as a nation? And what you want as a nation then tells you about fiscal sustainability. And I bet you anybody wants full employment, they want good public infrastructure, good health and transport and education systems and all of those things. Well, then what fiscal sustainability means is that the government is running whatever fiscal position is necessary to sustain the things that you want. It's as simple as that. It's got nothing to do... A 10% deficit of GDP might be required to do that. A 2% deficit, a 4% surplus might be required. Norway has got huge external income coming in, so it can provide the first-class public services and still run a small surplus. It's being sustainable because it's achieving the real goals of public purpose and well-being. A government fiscal policy isn't there to create a surplus or a deficit. So these definitions that are purely circular in terms of ratios that have virtually no meaning outside of context. And I think Tim's already mentioned, how can you establish credibility if you haven't got your own currency? That's the first point. That's why that's ridiculous. But there's a general principle here about central bank independence. One of the hallmarks of neoliberal period that we're now enduring as citizens is the way in which a number of responsibilities of government as our agents to advance our well-being have become depoliticised, is the term I use. And so depoliticisation is when the government appeals to external actors and constraints as cover for doing things they know are politically unpopular, but by deflecting the responsibility, they can depoliticise the unpopularity. Now, Britain's got a great history of that. In 1976, Dennis Healey lied to the British people about the running out of money and having to borrow from the IMF. What Dennis Healey at the time was, he had become infested with monetarism and wanted to have austerity as the solution to what he saw as the problem. And those old enough will remember this period, I'm sure. And he just depoliticised the unpopular austerity by saying it's forced on us by the IMF. At the moment, they're depoliticising that green austerity by pumping all the pressure down to the local councils who are getting all the flack for the cuts in services. And one of the other big ways in which it's happened is this central bank independence myth, that, oh no, we've created these independent central banks and they're the ones doing it to you. Well, let me tell you that central banks cannot be independent. Every day, the Treasury and the central bank operational officers have to talk because the fiscal policy influences the state of the cash system, which influences the monetary policy decisions being taken. And that's quite apart from the fact that central banks are legislative creatures of the state. And so Warren's idea is that he mentioned is what I believe to be the core MMT position, is that we delegitimise all of this central bank independence stuff. And if the central banks are really worried about inflation, well then they can use their very, very advanced brain power to run a job guarantee system. Another principle underpinning the fiscal rules is this idea of government and non-government savings. So when you... You're going to be right, Warren? When treasurers or chancellors in your context are moving towards fiscal surpluses, they say, isn't it wonderful, we're increasing national savings and we're taking the debt monkey off the citizens by retiring debt. Well, there's no such thing as government saving for a currency issuing government. I'm a household, I'm a user of the currency that the government issues. So for me to have, relative to my income opportunities, to have higher future consumption, I have to sacrifice some current consumption. How do I do that? I save. And then I put it in the bank and I get some measly interest rate and I get higher consumption possibilities in the future. That's what we mean by saving. But a currency issuing government never has to do that because its fiscal position today doesn't limit what it can do tomorrow. The government it doesn't make any sense to save in its own currency. And the next statement is that when a government says that isn't it wonderful we're running surpluses or moving towards surpluses, what they really, if they're honest, should be saying is, isn't it shocking that we're undermining your previous wealth accumulation? Because what fiscal surpluses do is, by definition, destroy non-government sector wealth dollar for dollar, pound for pound, kilt for kilt. I'm not accepting that, by the way. That's his idea. Don't call it the kilt, please. So there's a dollar for dollar relationship between the government balance and the non-government balance. That's pure MMT. And if everybody understood that, a politician would never be able to claim virtue for fiscal surpluses unless there was a context to justify that. A couple more slides. Foreign currency reserves. Tim's already dealt with this very well, but what he didn't say, and it's not a criticism, we all have our own agendas, is that why the hell would you want foreign currency reserves if you've got your own currency? Because if you've got your own currency, to maximise its capacity, you float it. You don't peg it. You only need foreign currency reserves if you have a peg or you're trying to maintain some fixity that the market doesn't want you to do. And the progressive people in Scotland that I've been reading are saying, gosh, we've got to have 40 billion or 30, and they're debating about how much it'll be and trying to come up with bigger figures to make it look better. It's irrelevant. And these ideas I've been reading from some Scottish commentators that we will have to immediately issue a euro-denominated debt so that we can stockpile euros. What would you do that for? That's just exposing you to default risk. A currency issuing government can repay all liabilities in its own currency, but not necessarily those denominated in another currency. You'd never borrow in a foreign currency. Attractiveness for investors, this was one of the rules, sort of, and underlying that was the idea that investors are going to freak out if you've got your own currency. Well, I've done a lot of work around the world in different countries, and what you learn from that sort of career is that what attracts business investment is high levels of output and production and income generation, in other words, full employment, stable government with a stable rule of law that underpins contractual certainty, good education system, good training systems, high levels of skill in your labour force. If you've got that, and a currency issuing government can always generate those things, if you've got those things, you'll have business investment pouring in here. Because at the moment businesses are looking for yield, they can't find it. Anyone that's giving them yield in a stable, certain way is going to be booming. So don't worry about that. And ability to avoid recession, well, I've read stories in the Scottish press, we'll have this, we'll just go into recession. Well, how do you go into recession? You go into recession because there's not enough spending. That's all it is. It's not enough spending. Don't think it's anything more sophisticated than that. So if households get the jitters when you go independent and start saving more, if your export markets decline a little bit immediately, well then what do you do about it? You increase your fiscal deficit to fill the gap, and there is no financial crisis that's big enough that a proper use of fiscal policy can't attenuate. So if you go into recession, it'll be because your government is misbehaving and it's being advised by idiots. And that's probably the certainty. Who would we trade with? Someone asked last night, with all due respect, we won't disclose who they were, but they said, well, who would we trade with? It's sort of and people who say this are the ones who eulogise about the virtues of capitalism. Yet they don't actually trust the thing that they are holding out as the exemplar. Capitalism chases profit. And it's Warren's point. The people spending the money are not really going to care whether you've got full employment or whether your government's running a deficit. They're wanting to know whether they can ship something to a wholesaler who can ship it into a shop and sell the bloody stuff. That's what capitalism is, profit seeking. And the last few points. Exchange rate arrangements float. Don't consider any other arrangement at all and pressure your political parties to get over this thing of pegs or dollarisation or sterlinisation or whatever thing you want to know. British debt, Warren's covered it. Why would you want to assume responsibility for deficits that haven't been taxed in from the past in pounds? Why would the New Scotland want to accept responsibility for that? But I know that all the debate is about, well, how are we going to share up the debt? Idiocy. Who owns the oil? Well, it seems obvious to me that our international rules say that it's in your continental shelf who owns the resources. And, you know, I come from a country that's absolutely shameful in its dealings with one of the poorest countries, East Timor, whose citizens during the Second World War died brutal deaths under the Japanese to defend our soldiers. What did Australia do? They tried to redefine the continental shelf between East Timor and Australia because they worked out that there were bloody oil wells on the side that they wanted to claim. Pricks. So who owns the oil? I think you've already worked it out when you divided it up between Norway and the UK at the beginning. There's some sort of geographic line, median line or something. The mapper knows it. Tim. And after independence, should the new government issue debt? Well, Warren has already told you, why would you issue debt? Debt is corporate welfare. Public debt really is what I call corporate welfare. They're it gives them a safe haven when there's uncertainty in the commercial debt markets, and it allows them to benchmark price risk off a risk-free asset. And in 1996, Liberal government was elected in Australia, started to run surpluses, and by the end of the decade, they were not reissuing the debt as it was maturing. Who do you think? So the fixed income public debt markets were becoming very thin. That is, there was less debt being able to be traded. Who do you think complained about that? Anyone in the audience want to know who complained about that? Sydney's Futures Exchange, the big investment banks, Commonwealth Bank, they all complained. It didn't, and there was this massive, remember that? And there was an inquiry. And you should have read the special pleading that the financial markets put in to demand that the government kept issuing debt, even though they were running fiscal surpluses. Now, it never occurred to them in the financial press, which has a history of berating the government for issuing too much debt to fund its government spending. They didn't twig that if the government's running surpluses, why, in their own logic, why would they be continuing to issue debt? That sort of escaped them, which is what hypocrites always do. But what the Australian government agreed to, even though they ran after that increasing fiscal surpluses, they agreed with the financial markets to issue a massive amount of debt guaranteed each period. Corporate welfare. And it was the same characters who on the public record were berating the government for paying excessive unemployment benefits. Pricks. And the last thing I'll say, which will take about 2 minutes, is EU membership and euro. You'll destroy your country if you join the EU. You'll destroy it slightly quicker if you take the euro. And I know there's debates within progressives that, the euro isn't the EU. No, it's not. But all the euro is the most advanced form of the neoliberalism that is entrenched in the basic legal structure of the EU. So these Europhile left people that are bound everywhere, who tell everybody that, we accept that the EU's a corporate cabal, but we will reform it. We'll make it democratic. It's dreaming. They never tell you, and I'm sure a lot of you don't actually know what the treaty revision process requires. You have to get 28, hopefully 27 soon, member states to agree simultaneously. It's not going to happen. Not going to happen. And so a body that is being created deliberately and embedded from ground up within its legal structure to have neoliberal principles, single markets and all the rest of it, that is rough treating municipalities with procurement rules, that what they can and can't do, which prevents governments like the future Labor government in UK of being able to run a monopoly for water, transport, energy, whatever, is the last thing an independent nation would want to do. Independence means that your democracy is underpinned by your legislature, which you influence as voters. It doesn't mean that some technocrats, neoliberal technocrats in Brussels, who do dirty deals with the IMF to destroy nations and render them colonies like Greece, have a say over your legislation and can countermand it, and you have to accept it. And it also means that any legal challenges that citizens want to make of that legislation are rendered within your own legal system, whatever you would call your highest court. It doesn't mean that a remote court, the European Court of Justice, has priority over your legislative interpretations. And it also independence doesn't mean that you are forced to take trade agreements negotiated by Brussels that privilege corporations through investor dispute mechanisms over the legislative power of your nation state, such that legislation that you introduce to further the well-being of your people can be overruled by investor. You can be sued by corporations because it impinges on their profits. That's what joining the EU is all about. And if you think you're progressive and you think that EU is somehow an example of cosmopolitanism and internationalism and globalism, you've got rocks in your head. The cosmopolitanism of the EU extends to their border, and then they allow people to die who want to get into the cosmopolitan utopia on the beaches in the southern states. So an independent Scotland, if you want to be independent, you don't join up with the EU. That's my last statement. Thank you.